G'day Jafffa Adventures, Terry King here. Welcome to the channel. Welcome to another episode on the FJ45 restomod. Last episode I left you off with the modifications to the transmission tunnel to clear the 6-speed and modifying the floor so that I can actually bolt this cab in place. Now that she's sitting where she needs to be, I can move on to some of the ancillary systems in the car. And the reason I needed the tub located on the chassis properly is I've got to start bolting some things up to the firewall here. The first system I'm going to tackle is the braking system. Now I've already done a video on installing a 60 series front disc brake system on this car and installing an 80 series rear drum brakes that have the handbrake components within inside of the drum. Hop into my FJ45 playlist and you'll find how-to videos on both the front and the rear brakes. This video, however, is going to focus on plumbing up the brakes, running a handbrake cable, and installing a very modern master cylinder system. Check this out. So laid out on this bench are all of the components that I've got to hand to hopefully start and finish this job. Over on this side of the table I've got all the original componentry. There's the original handbrake, original clutch and brake pedal, original brake cylinder, and some of the miscellaneous fittings that I would need to complete this job. Over on this side of the table is some of the new componentry. And this Hydroboost unit here is probably the heart of the entire system. It's a hydraulic braking system that works off of your power steering pump. Got all the fittings and plumbing to hook it up to the power steering pump. Got an 80 series master cylinder. Got some brake line and brake fittings. Got the little bits that can bolt it to the chassis. And over on this table I've got a handbrake cable for a 79 Series Landcruiser. All right, let's see if I can turn this pile of bits into an operational braking system. So our original brake master cylinder just bolted up like that. I'm not going to use anything out of this master cylinder except maybe the clevis if I need it. There's two real disadvantages with these original master cylinders. The first one is it's only one circuit, so you've got one reservoir that feeds both front and rear brakes. If you lose a brake line in the rear, for example, you lose all brakes, both front and rear. Secondly, it's a manual braking system. And when I've got a donk like that underneath the bonnet, I need all the stopping power I can get. The Hydroboost unit fits in like this. But on the back of the Hydroboost, you've got this large nut, which does not fit through that hole. Now, you could, if you wanted, open up that hole, or the likes of a company called Refab Engineering make this little spacer that allows you to bolt it up just like that. And that's the route that I'm going to go down. So what I'll do is I'll mark these 4 bolt holes and drill that firewall out so I can bolt up this Hydroboost unit. Give myself a level on there so I can get this thing clocked correctly. Right there. Now we'll pop that in there. Center it on the holes so that I can mark that bottom hole. Start with some pilot hole. What appears to be a really simple job and should be a really simple job is going to turn out to be a real bitch, because in behind here is all of the framework that holds the pedals in place. All of this stuff here is where those bolts will be going through. Far out. Now I've just discovered that the bolts that fit through this refab bracket do not fit through there. It's close, but I'm going to have to drill those out marginally to allow that to clearance. Okay, one bolt down. At least that one clears all the pedal componentry on the backside. Alright, there's 2. Our bracket remains level. Good. Now I got 2 bolts holding that in just so that this doesn't move when I'm drilling the pilot holes for these 2 bottom ones. And our Hydroboost unit is not fouling on that inner hole. Great. Okay, those 3 need to come through the back side, and that one there needs to go through the front side because it interferes with some of the pedal componentry. Tighten these bolts down, and the beauty of this is, once I'm all finished this, I get to take it all off. Now there's some of the relieving that I had to do to get these bolts into the back side. A little bit around here, had to chop that out, and I had to relieve that a little bit to get that bolt in there. That's what she looks like installed. The next step is I'll pop some pedals in there and see whether I can get that clevis to hook up to the existing Toyota pedal. Alright, pedals in place. Looks like that clevis is going to line up nicely. Sweet. Now there's a locking bolt that goes in there. I'll probably flog the one out of the clutch because I don't have a clutch anymore. But that's it. That brake pedal is in place. And that clevis works well. Awesome. Next, I'm going to plumb up the Hydroboost before I put that master cylinder on there because that might just get into my road a little bit. There's my power steering pump that I'm aiming for. And there's my fittings here down on the bottom of the pump. Now here's the pressure line for the Hydroboost, which goes up underneath the power steering pump. And I don't have the correct fitting, so I can't put that in. And this here is the return line. And both of those lines run up. I'll run them along the firewall to the Hydroboost unit itself. That's our high pressure side. And that one goes there as our return line. So I'm satisfied that that plumbing is not going to get into the road of anything, which means I can move on, mount my master cylinder, and I can start to plumb some brake lines. Well, there's a problem right at the get-go. That master cylinder reservoir fouls that accumulator. And as you can see, there's a nice big gap there. Just awesome. If I could mount it a little bit off center like that, that'd work a treat. Well, the fix wasn't as difficult as I thought it was going to be. I undid that screw there, and you can actually pull that off and spin it around. Now, that screw's not lined up properly, so I'll have to drill and tap that, but that's no big deal. But what it does mean is my master cylinder no longer fouls that accumulator. Whew, dodged a bullet on that one. Now I've got that drilled and tapped. So we can mount that master cylinder in place now. All right, master cylinder in place. Excellent. And that will easily clear the bonnet line. Sweet. Now it's time to fab up some brake lines. Now I've got myself some brake line here, and I'm going to install the main brake line that runs from the rear diff up to the front to the master cylinder. Now I've got these crusty old hoses. I got new ones on order. They haven't arrived quite yet. What I'm going to do is mount that bracket up there and then run the brake line along the chassis rail to the front. I pulled that little junction box off of the original brake line, which I will mount there. So the brake line will come in this direction from the front, and then it'll change direction and run straight up. Now you don't need a junction box like that. You can just bend the brake line. However, I've got it, so I'm going to use it. Here's my original brake line, and I'll just use that as a template to get the length of my new one. Now I've just got a baby pipe cutter here that I'll use to chop this brake line up. There we go. Perfect little cut. All right, let me show you one of the best tools that I have purchased. I know I say that a lot. I got a lot of these best tools, but this thing is awesome. I've used the old crappy flaring tools before, and trust me, buy yourself a good one if you're going to do a decent number of flares, because it just is worth its weight in gold. So I'm dealing with a 3/16 inch. And these little dies are stamped 3/16, and there's two ends. You can see that end there's kind of got flat, and that end there's got a taper. We start with the flat end. So you pop that little sucker into the jaws of life. We then get our brake line, and don't forget this. Slide on your little bloody fitting before you do that flare. I don't know how many flares I've done where I've forgotten to put that on, and then you just got to end up chopping it off again. Open up our die, put our pipe in there, drop that over, and tighten him down. Now these things have little OP markings on it. This one says OP0. Now I get the handle, pop the handle in, and that OP0 just pushes your pipe. So you leave this a little bit loose, but it just pushes your pipe so that it's flush with the end of that die, which is where you want it to be. Okie dokie. Once you've done that, tighten him down. Now you read for your OP1 on your 3/16 inch, and that's it there. Now we open that up again, have a look, and that's the first part of the flare. It's basically just squashed the tube down because it's using a square part of the die. We then take our die and flip it over so that we're using the 45-degree end. Pop him back in, grab our pipe, pop our pipe back in, make sure that pipe is flush with the end of the die. Tighten that back down again, and then spin this little sucker around to OP2. I'm assuming OP means operation. And then whack him down again. And there we've got it. Perfect flare every single time. Now I've got these fancy little clippy doodads that just affix onto the frame so that your brake line doesn't rattle and carry on like a pork chop. I'll try and use as many of the factory holes as I can, and where I don't have factory holes, I'll just use tech screw. I do have some of these machine screws as well, which were the ones that were originally holding this brake line in place. Nice. Right, our brake line is down, and as you can see, that is nice and tight, and it won't slap up against the frame because of each of those little hold down jobbies I've used. Comes up over the transmission cross member towards the front of the vehicle and into that little junction box. From there I'm going to run a line straight up to our master cylinder. Started to get a little bit carried away, and I'm fabricating this brake line for the rear already, and I forgot to film it. So anyway, it's chopped down to size. I'm going to put a bracket in this spot here, another one up here, and I'll run this brake line along to the back of the master cylinder. There's the rear brake line done. Pretty simple. Just runs straight up through a couple of these little clamps around and into the rear chamber of the master cylinder. Next up, we got to fabricate a front brake line. I think on our front brake line, there's the rubber hose that it connects to. I'm going to come along here, along the front, down the inside of the chassis rail, and then up to the master cylinder. Now that I've got all of the brake lines plumbed up to the master cylinder, I can share with you bonehead mistake number 842. This is a proportioning valve. This proportioning valve should have been installed in the rear brake lines here, so I can dial in the correct pressure to the rear brakes without having them lock up before the front brakes do. So now that I've got all those brake lines installed, I'll take that little sucker out of there, chop a bit out of it, and I'll install the proportioning valve in there where it should have been in the first place. Now I'll mark where I'm going to chop this little sucker. We're going to take it there and there. Now I'm going to chop this pipe off with our little pipe cutter. Now these Wilwood proportioning valves are actually marked in and out, so you really can't get that wrong. from the master cylinder into the proportioning valve, and then out of the proportioning valve down to the rear brakes. All right, I got my flare on the end. Just got a little dolly here that I'm going to use to create the arc on this brake line. Something like that. Nice. That pops there like so. And then this line, which needs to be flared yet, pop in there like so. Cool. So I'll chop him off on the mark that I made. All right, I got my flare on the other side now. There we have it, proportioning valve done. I'm not going to tighten those fittings all up because I've got to take it all off anyway when I go to paint the tub. Okay, brake line's done. Let's move on to the handbrake. All right, here's our factory handbrake. That obviously mounts up under the dash. That's the factory handbrake cable. That end mounts up to the firewall, runs through the firewall, and that there hooks onto there through the guts. So that's the factory cable. Now the 79 series, let's open this up. And by the way, there is the part number if anybody is chasing after this, 46410-6A030. Now this is the end that runs along the differential. That end there goes to one backing plate. That end there goes to the second backing plate, which means that puppy runs up to the front. That has to join up with my factory cable. So I think first things first, I'll put this cable in location on the back diff and work my way forward. So here's how I'm going to run the 79 series handbrake cable. These backing plates are off of an 80 series, but they're the exact same backing plates off a 60 series, and maybe even a late model 40. That will sit in there on a clevis. That cable runs along the diff. And once I get that out of the road, that'll sit there as well. On the 79 cable, you've got this little cable runner. I'm going to bolt that to the back of the diff. That'll allow that shock to get cleared. This little cable guide here, I'm going to bolt there to the back of the diff there. And then the only thing we've got left is this pivot point, which has to be sitting out from the diff a few inches to clear that shock. Right, the cable is hooked up to the driver's side. It runs along the back of the diff through this small bracket, which is supplied to this hinge point, which I haven't dealt with yet, over to the other backing plate on the passenger side. And you can see here, I've got about 5 mil clearance between the shock and that cable. Now the next step is to fabricate a bracket so that I can mount this pivot point, because that makes the actual brake work. So let me scratch my head and see what I'm going to do on that one. All right, here's what I've come up with. I've got an old shackle here, and I've just chopped the end off it. I'll weld that there. Those two holes line up, and that'll be my pivot point for the handbrake. That clears the shock, no worries. I found this pin in my spares box. That pin will drop through there. I'll chop that off and I'll put a split pin or a cotter pin through there. And then that, I'll sit on top of that. I'll run a tap over this and run a couple of more threads down and put a nylock nut on that. And there it is. There's my pivot. So here's what I've got. I chopped the thread off that and drilled a hole in there. So it'll allow it to fit through there. And I'll be able to put a split pin through there. And it sits on that shoulder anyway, so it's not going to drop through. So that's that side. Got a nylon washer. Pop that on there like so, steel washer, and then a nylock nut. And I'll run that nylock nut down so that obviously that still is free and is allowed to pivot in there. So I think that's going to work for me. I just need to weld this tab on the diff housing. All right, I got a little shield here, aluminum shield, just to protect the brake line while I'm doing this welding. Get that little sucker there. That's all right. Looks pretty level. We're good to go. Do a little bit in that corner, and then I'll get underneath and finish it up underneath. I changed my tact a little bit on this one. I had that cotter pin slip through the bottom there. I decided to weld it, so that's fully welded in there now. Just need this little sucker to cool down so I can hit it with a bit of paint. And we can continue on to the next phase, so we'll march forward with our cable. Nylon washer. Second nylon washer. Big flat washer. And nut. There we go. So just as a reminder, we got that hooked up to the brake backing plate. Just clearing the shocky there. You should be able to see it, a couple of mil. There's our spacer off the diff. And there's our cable running over to the other brake backing plate. This one here's got a couple of millimeters clear of the shock. And the cable is roughly level. It's pretty bloody close. I wanted to level her a little bit more. I'll just bend that down. There we go, that's pretty bloody level across the back of the diff. Now I've had to fabricate myself a little L bracket here. And the reason for that is I've got to orient this guy in the right direction. So the idea behind that, I've got a little spacer here so that it'll clear this brake line. And then this is oriented in the right direction to allow that cable to run pretty freely. So that's all of the cables and bracketry around the rear diff area finished. From there the cable runs along. I've got it sitting here with a clamp at the moment, but I'll weld or bolt that in, not sure yet. Runs along here to a second bracket where that will be bolted in, and then runs along here to the end. And on this cable we've got a threaded end. Now up at the other end, this is our cable that runs from the handbrake. I'm gonna have to tie that out of the way just because it's a little bit too close to that exhaust manifold for my liking. That runs along here. I've got one bracket holding it here. I've got a second bracket holding it here over the transmission cross member, and it comes out right here. Now the way I'm going to join those two cables up is with this little C bracket. That actually came in a kit for a handbrake for a 1957 Chevy, but it's gonna work for my purposes here. So on our 45 series cable end, we'll pop that in like so. And then on our 79 series end, we pop that in like so. And on that one, it's actually got a threaded rod. So that's how those two cables will be joined up. The last thing that I need to do is weld that little tab here onto the chassis. And that little spring clip on the end of the 79 series cable will slip into there and click into place and lock into place. Then we can pull our handbrake on and see whether this whole affair works or not. All right, and I'll weld that little tab there. That cable will click into that hole with that little spring component on it, and that will lock this cable in place from moving. So let me break out the welder and weld that tab in place. While I had the welder out, I welded up these brackets rather than drilling and screwing them in. And that bracket there is all finished. Okie dokie. Now that cable clicks into here, like so. So that's how that cable looks locked in there. That's how that bracket looks screwed together. That side there's got one of those pressed on fittings, and of course that's the one that I've just screwed on. I'll put a little bit of Loctite on there once I get this adjusted up properly. But I think we're in a position now to be able to pull that handbrake cable and see whether this actually works or not. Now I've got the handbrake mechanism all hooked up underneath here, and that's how that one works. So let's have a look at our cable when I pull that. That's just friggin' awesome. I got an operational handbrake cable. I'm absolutely wrapped with that. A handbrake cable cobbled together with the original 45 and a 79 series. I trust you guys found some entertainment value here, or maybe even learned a thing or two. I know I certainly did. I'll catch you next time around when I'm wrenching on the FJ45. I think the fuel tank is next. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. Keep your shiny side up. Bye now.